Focus, focus, focus.
Prairie grass of the day. Sporobolus asper, hollow drop seed or composite drop seed. Another C4 grass. We're doing plants at Kanza. At Kanza, what should you expect a lot of in terms of C3 versus C4? You should expect a lot of C4. Here we have another C4 grass.
Okay, are we going to clarify on the C3, C4 grasses, or did that happen on Friday?
Oh, it's Friday.
Okay.
Yeah, Friday. We talked about that. Yeah, spent a lot of time actually on that. Grasshoppers eat this a lot, so we talked about one of the prairie animals of the day was a common grasshopper. One of the things when we think about grazers at Kanza is we oftentimes think of the big mammalian, charismatic megafauna kind of grazer, which is bison, but don't forget that insects are also grazers. And in some cases, these grazers can be very important at structuring plant communities. And so when you find a plant that is fed heavily on by grasshoppers, grasshoppers produce lots of offspring. We saw when we looked at that grasshopper species, they produce lots of offspring. They can be prone to very fast population growth, and as a result, they can eat a lot of grass. Other grazers don't care for this plant as much. It's drought tolerant because it's a C4 grass, and once again, we get flowers late in the year, which is also typical of what we call warm season grasses, these C4 grasses. One of my favorite forbs of the prairie is lead plant. You haven't done lead plant yet, have you?
No.
Yeah, I didn't think you had. Lead plants, I've got 3 of these growing in my yard at my house. It was still flowering up until about a week ago. It is a legume. It's in the family of Fabaceae. Amorpha canescens, you can see the pinnately compound leaves. They have this silvery green color. It's a very distinctive plant in the prairie. It's very localized though. There are stretches of Kanza where you can find parts of Kanza where there's a lot of it, and then you'll go through a big stretch of Kanza where you won't find any of it, and then you'll find a lot of it again in places. It doesn't reproduce through rhizomes, but they do tend to be clustered in many cases for whatever reason. Because it's in the family of Fabaceae, it's a nitrogen fixer, has root nodules associated with its roots that house nitrogen-fixing bacteria, which we will talk about later on today. Like I said, the pinnately compound leaves, and it gets that silvery hue because it has these fine hairs that are on the leaves. So Amorpha canescens, the lead plant. And I'm not sure why it's called lead plant, actually. I should know that and don't. Prairie animal of the day is a species that I studied for my dissertation research. Schizocosa ocreata. It's called the brush-legged wolf spider because the males have these brushes on the legs. The reason that I'm calling attention to it is that quite a lot of study has been done on this species of spider at Kanza. It's been shown that when you fence off sections of the prairie and keep this spider away, grasshoppers will tend to remain in those fenced off areas more so. So it has the ability to affect plant community structure by affecting the herbivores that graze on certain species of plants. So when they're present, they basically, just by their presence, they keep grasshoppers away. That then protects the plants that grasshoppers feed on, and that then affects plant species communities. So that's a cool interaction.
Do you remember what we called that kind of interaction when we talk about indirect interactions?
Trophic cascade.
Yep.
Nice.
This is a top-down effect in a trophic cascade, where as the spider increases in abundance, it suppresses the grasshopper by either eating it directly or by scaring it away, and then that ends up being good for, in this case, grasses like dropseed. And so the spider has an effect on the grasses through its intermediate effects on the herbivore. The behavior has been studied pretty widely. These guys use these brush legs to signal females during courtship. They can have a lot of spiderlings, which makes them good for doing genetics. And they're in this group of spiders, the wolf spiders, the Lycosidae, that carry egg sacs around with them, which is nice for genetics also, because if you catch a female with an egg sac, you also have all of her offspring. And then after they hatch, the offspring crawl onto the back, and she carries them around for a period of time. So it's a good model organism within I'm not sure, and nobody's really been able to answer that question, but presumably any degree of parental care increases your rate of survival. It turns out that the female's appetite is suppressed for the time period that they're carrying offspring. So if you knock a spider off the back of a female, she won't eat it while she's still carrying offspring. But if you take that spider, that same spider laying 2 weeks later and then present it to her, she'll treat it just like if it was any other spider and she will eat it. So they don't recognize their offspring, but they have this behavioral suppression of appetite during the time that they're carrying offspring. So that they basically don't eat anything. You can also feed them a cricket and they won't eat it.
Interesting.
So, plant, animal, grass, forb, animal of the day. So in this case, we might ask something about the plants and animals because there's this link between a grass species that grasshoppers like, the grasshopper itself, and the spider species that feeds on the grasshoppers, and talking about trophic cascades would be an excellent test question having to do with that. So, we're talking about nutrient cycling. We introduced the basics of nutrient cycling, where we can divide the world into soil, things that exist on top of the soil, things that bridge the soil-atmosphere interface. We have the atmosphere, and then we have exports out of soil in the form of things like leaching of resources. So this is generally going to be animals, microbes live down in the soil as well as on the surface. But then plants have this dual life where part of the plant lives above the ground in what we refer to as the shoot, and the other part of the plant lives below ground in what we refer to as the root. And so you can start partitioning the space of an ecosystem up into these various pools. Remember, towards the end of class last time, I told you what pools, fluxes, and transformations were, right? What is a pool?
Portion of the ecosystem we find nutrients.
Okay, it's a portion of the ecosystem where you find nutrients being housed. What is a flux? Movement from one pool to another. What is a transformation?
Changing between forms.
That flux when it changes forms, if you go from carbon dioxide to glucose or glucose back to carbon dioxide. So these transformations, all fluxes are fluxes, but only some fluxes are also transformations. So I want to go back and revisit something that we talked about earlier in this case study when Jonas surprised me with selenium as being in one of the amino acids. Why do we need to talk about these nutrients? Well, these nutrients get used in things. So when we look at nucleic acids, the nitrogenous bases of the nucleic acids contain a lot of nitrogen. You've got nitrogen here, there, nitrogen here, there, nitrogen here and there, nitrogen, 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 nitrogen. A lot of nitrogen in just the nitrogenous base part of nucleic acids. We have phosphorus in the sugar phosphate backbone. We have phosphorus in the form of ATP to use for energy transport within organisms. And then when we look at amino acids, we also have a lot of nitrogen. Every monomer unit of an amino acid has nitrogen at the very least in the amine group in the backbone of the growing protein. But then when you start looking at the side chains, you see that many of the side chains also contain nitrogen. Occasionally they will contain sulfur, and rarely they will contain selenium, even though I don't normally think of selenium when I think of amino acids. So the reason you want to know how nutrients are cycled is because organisms need these nutrients, and these nutrients can be lost from ecosystems, and so it's of interest to ecologists to know how these organisms that are in an ecosystem keep the nutrients in the ecosystem rather than losing them through something like leaching out of soil, going into stream flow, being carried downstream, and being lost from that ecosystem permanently. So to kind of get this across to you, we want to talk about cycles in general but we want to then expand this to talk about specific cycles in particular. And the ones that I'm going to go through with you are the carbon cycle, and I'm going through the carbon cycle with you primarily because that cycle is easy to understand. And if you can understand the carbon cycle, then it makes approaching the nitrogen cycle, which is way more complicated, a little more digestible. So we're going to start with easy things. But essentially, a cycle is just identifying all of the pools, identifying the possible fluxes that go between pools, and then knowing what forms the carbon are in those pools and whether those fluxes are just transfers of glucose from one pool to another, or if you're transforming that glucose into something else like carbon dioxide and you have a transformation. So when we think about the carbon cycle, there are basically two reactions that you have to worry about. They're the two reactions that Dr. Judd was talking about when he was talking about photosynthesis. One of them is photosynthesis, where you take carbon dioxide, combine it with water, and produce glucose. And the other transformation is just the reverse of that, where you take glucose, combine it with oxygen, and get carbon dioxide and water as the byproducts. In this case, you're going from low energy substances, low energy compounds, to higher energy compounds, so you have to have energy input. That energy input is in the form of solar energy. That solar energy is captured by the light reactions, the photosystems that basically create ATP and NADPH. And then we take those high energy compounds, we oxidize them, and we break those carbon-carbon bonds apart, and those bonds contain energy that we then use to power the metabolism of organisms. We release carbon dioxide, which goes back to the atmosphere, and we also lose a certain amount of this energy in the form of heat, which then just dissipates into the atmosphere. The difficult thing about the carbon cycle is that it's not as cyclic as something like nitrogen is. Oftentimes we think of energy as flowing through a system. Energy comes from the sun, gets captured by plants, gets transferred from plants to other organisms that eat it. Those organisms are doing metabolism, blowing off some of that energy in the form of heat and CO2, and everybody eventually dies. When you die, all of the glucose that is in you gets digested away by bacteria, and once again, those bacteria are doing metabolism, breaking that glucose down to CO2, releasing heat, and so ultimately energy comes into the system in the form of sunlight, gets captured by plants, and then over time is slowly then released back to the atmosphere in the form of low energy compounds of CO2 and the dissipation of heat, essentially. So I'm going to teach you the carbon cycle, but it's not really cyclic in that it kind of flows through ecosystems, comes in one end and goes out the other end. But it does cycle because it does get transferred from organism to organism, and we can keep track of that actually. So let's start. I asked you to take a rough cut at a carbon cycle over the weekend. So if we have soil, we have animals, and I realize that this is a cartoon of the world because we're not including things like fungi and a lot of bacteria and things like this. But if we just break the world into plants and animals, we have the shoots here, we have the roots here, and the atmosphere out here. We have soil here. What's the form of carbon that's going to be in the atmosphere? Carbon dioxide. Is there a lot of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere? Percentage-wise, there's not a ton, but the atmosphere is big. So there's a pool of carbon in the atmosphere, which is in the form of carbon dioxide. Where is that carbon dioxide going to go?
Photosynthesis.
Photosynthesis. So photosynthesis is done by who? Plants, and done by what part of plants?
The shoots.
It's going to be done by the shoots of plants. So this is a flux. This flux is photosynthesis. And is this flux just a flux, or is it also a transformation? It's also a transformation, because what is the form that you're going to find glucose in plants? Go ahead.
Solid?
Well, what particular compound?
Oh,
Glucose. And you're going to find it in the form of glucose that makes up things like starch. You're going to find it a lot in glucose that makes up cellulose. Remember, where do we find cellulose in plants? In cell walls. And every plant cell has a cell wall, and there are a lot of plant cells in plants. And so there's a lot of cellulose that is basically just repeated units of glucose. So there's a lot of glucose in plants. Where is this glucose ultimately going to go?
Gets broken down.
To soil or animals eat it.
Okay, so animals can eat it. So this is, what do we call this? Herbivory. And is this going to be changing states? No, we use glucose to generate ATP, so it comes to animals in the form of glucose. We do repurpose a lot of this carbon to make things like carbon-containing molecules in our body, but in terms of energy, glucose is one big form of it. What else can happen to plants?
They can die.
They respire, so they undergo respiration, cellular respiration. And I always put cellular in front of this because we also, in a medical sense, we talk about humans respiring, i.e. breathing in and out. I never refer to humans as respiring unless I'm talking about cellular respiration. So I separate cellular respiration from breathing because they're two totally different processes. But I'll almost always put cellular in front of respiration so that you know that I'm talking about this equation, not the act of breathing. So in cellular respiration, this is a flux, right? And it's going to go back to the atmosphere. So it's basically taking glucose, getting the energy out of glucose, and giving off CO2. What are animals doing with this glucose that they get from plants?
Same thing, cellular
They're
respiration.
doing the same thing. They're doing cellular respiration. What else is happening to plants?
They die.
They die. What happens to all the energy that is in them? It goes into the soil. So we'll just put a big box here. Death. I realize that death only applies to humans, but plants also die. And the glucose here goes into the soil, essentially. And what happens in soil? Bacteria live here. And they're going to use the dead bodies of us and all the plants and leaves and everything else, and they're going to use that for energy. When they're done using that for energy, what do they give off? They give off CO2.
Yeah.
This is sometimes referred to as soil respiration. Who was asking me about soil respiration at the end of the class last time? So Jonas asked me, like what about all these microbes in soil? And the tricky thing about studying microbes in soil is we know so little about microbes in soil. Really probably hyper-diverse soil communities. We don't know how much of them are there. We don't know what species are there necessarily. To study them, you basically scoop up soil, you extract DNA from it, and you use DNA sequencing to identify functional groups of soil that live in soil. I have a former student who works at the University of Montana that does this. But normally when we go to measure soil respiration, we have a little bit of soil. We get a big piece of PVC that we put a fitting over the top of. It has a little gas spigot coming off of it. We drive that thing down into the ground. There's a little spigot that pokes up. We put a hose on that, and we put a syringe on that, and we suck the air out of this thing. We've pounded it into the ground, and we leave it there for a while, and as it's sitting there in the ground, the microbes that are doing cellular respiration are releasing CO2 into this space that is above ground. We siphon off how that CO2 is building up in that space. We get it analyzed, we compare that to what the atmosphere is in terms of CO2 at the time that we take that, and so we measure how much carbon dioxide is being generated by soil. And we call it soil respiration, but soil itself isn't respiring, isn't doing cellular respiration. It's the organisms in the soil that are doing the respiring. So while we may not know how many bacteria are in here generating that CO2, we know that bacteria are in there generating that CO2 because we can measure the respiration that they're putting out. A lot of carbon gets stored in soil. A big pool of soil carbon gets stored. And so we've identified most of the pools and most of the fluxes in a carbon cycle. But now the trick is putting numbers on all these things. And you can go to almost any textbook and it will give you amounts that happen between what the size of the pools are and what the fluxes are. So we have atmospheric carbon dioxide, about 760 times 10 to the 15th grams. So these are all going to be in gigantic amounts of carbon. Of that 760 times 10 to the 15th, about 120 times 10 to the 15th gets fixed by plants every year through the process of carbon fixation in photosynthesis. So 120 of that 760 comes out of the atmosphere and into plant bodies every year. Then we have death and litter fall that all go into the dead organic matter pool in the soil. That gets broken down by bacteria, and of that it gets broken down by bacteria, about 5 times 10 to the 15th of it stays in soil every year, and the other 55 gets blown off in terms of soil respiration. So if you're keeping track, we can think about this in terms of a budget. How many of you have a budget for your finances? Oh, that's sad, only 4 of you. Well, those of you who keep budgets, what do?
You just make sure, like, you have your total amount and you set aside certain amounts of money for, like, certain things you need to spend money on. So, like, groceries, gas.
So let's say that you make $1,000 a month, which is sad. But let's say that you vote for Andrew Yang and he gets elected president and he's going to give you $1,000 a month in his universal income plan. You have $1,000 coming in a month. That's stuff added to your bank account, and then what comes out of that? Yeah, rent. Let's see, tuition. How much a month do you guys pay in tuition? Like, do you even pay it that way?
No.
Pay by semester.
We pay by semester,
By semester. So how much per semester?
like 20,000.
$20,000 per semester?
A little more, or not for. That's just total. That's like the total, not just for tuition.
Yeah, but scholarships,
Scholarship is 20, it's like 21.
Okay, so fall semester is how many months?
4-ish.
4-ish, 4.5-ish. Let's just say it's 4. That's $5,000 a month.
You also pay it all up front, like you don't pay it throughout the.
Yeah, I think we
Andrew
need.
Yang's not helping you guys much.
We need the Bernie Sanders free tuition.
Food is part of tuition, room and board, and all that stuff. So that's all in there.
No, it's not.
No,
Yeah, it is, that's the total cost.
That's what it's food.
22,000 is about right.
It's
It's
total.
about right for the total cost.
For the total cost
10.
per semester.
That's what food costs.
And you discover that you've taken out all of these things such that you're way in the hole. Which is, of course, why you hit up your parents constantly for money, which is why you take out federal student loans, et cetera, et cetera. Because your budget is unbalanced. You're spending way more money than you have money coming in. Well, we can do the same thing with the carbon cycle. We can say to ourselves, well, how much carbon do we have coming in to the system? Well, we have 120 times 10 to the 15th grams of carbon per year coming into the terrestrial ecosystem, primarily through photosynthesis. We lose 55 of that being blown back to the atmosphere through soil respiration. But we also lose some of that because not only are microbes in the soil doing respiration, but we also have respiration coming from all of these other organisms, which equals about 60 times 10 to the 15th grams of carbon per year. And so that's 120 coming in, and it looks like 115 going out, which means that ecosystems should store 5 times 10 to the 15 grams of carbon per year. Where is that being stored?
Soil.
It's being stored in soil. So we have animals excreting waste materials that go into decomposition, animals and plants dying, goes into decomposition, which basically gets quantified by ecologists as soil respiration. We have photosynthesis bringing carbon dioxide into the ecosystem in the form of glucose, and then we have respiration from plants above ground, plants and animals above ground, blowing this CO2 back to the atmosphere. Question?
Fire should take away an extra 3.8. Where's that coming from?
So hang with me for a minute.
Okay.
So this is storage. This is a net movement of carbon out of the atmosphere into terrestrial ecosystems. And so we have all these people like Greta Thunberg and Al Gore talking about global warming and rising CO2 levels in the atmosphere, and methane and a lot of other things, water vapor, all of these heat trapping gases in the atmosphere. But our initial carbon cycle shows that terrestrial ecosystems should be storing carbon over long periods of time. But what you have to consider is that that's not all that's going on. So one of the things that humans do, and they do this at Kanza, is what do they do at Kanza?
Light things on fire.
They light things on fire. We burn Kanza prairie because it's a good management strategy for maintaining prairie ecosystems, where the plants there are kind of adapted to thrive in fire-regulated ecosystems. But in the Amazon and in other places in the world, Dr. Judd showed you an image of the fires in the Amazon. Fire is used to clear forest for agriculture. So you chop down a bunch of trees, you burn that. A certain amount of the biomass that is in that gets volatilized and gets sent back into the atmosphere. In the case of carbon, it gets sent back up in CO2. But some of that ash stays on the ground and nourishes the soil on the ground, and then you can use that soil for a short period of time after you've converted it from forest to agriculture to grow crops. Unfortunately, in a rainforest, it rains a lot, and so you lose nutrients from soil through things like leaching. And so after you've farmed a plot of land for a while, you have to go and chop down some more forest to get some more fertile land, and then the amount of forest being converted to agriculture gets bigger and bigger. But when you take trees, where also a lot of carbon is stored, keep in mind, these trees and other plants, but a big chunk of this is trees, they take in 120 times 10 to the 15th grams of carbon per year, but they only respire 60 of that back. Which means a lot of carbon is being stored in the living tissue of plants. As soon as you chop down a forest and burn that, all that carbon gets, or most of that carbon gets released back to the atmosphere through the process of volatilization, basically blowing carbon dioxide. So it's not, actually, it's not a huge part, it's a portion of it. It gets blown back to the atmosphere. So that's 3.8. So we subtract 3.8 from total storage. So that's 1.5 times 10 to the 15th grams of carbon per year. But even with that activity, we're still looking at net storage. But then we start burning fossil fuels. Natural gas, coal, oil, other fossil fuels.
Those are the three big ones.
Those are the three big ones. And we do that to the tune of 5.3 times 10 to the 15th per year. And all of a sudden, we're at 4.2 times 10 to the 15th reason people are concerned about global warming is because there's proof that the world is warming up. But we know that it's driven by these kinds of substances that are floating around in the atmosphere that have the ability to trap heat. CO2 is one of these things. It's not the only one. It's not even the most effective one. But you end up with this net export of carbon out of terrestrial ecosystems back in the atmosphere. But this net export is due to human activities. We're the ones that are burning more land than we should, converting more land to agriculture, and we're certainly the ones that are using up all of these fossil fuels, because you don't see many polar bears riding around in their Hummer. And so when we talk about the net effect of human activities, it's basically taking a system that should be storing carbon year after year, and it's actually exporting carbon back to the atmosphere. Dr. Judd, you look like you want to say something.
Just for clarity, that stored carbon in the form of plant matter and algae matter that doesn't go back into the atmosphere is what those fossil fuels are. Natural gas, coal, and oil is the mass of algae and plants.
If you want to think of it this way, another way of thinking about this is a way that this guy named Herman Daly, who's an economist, thinks about it. Economically, on planet Earth, we spend a certain amount of energy every day to basically support human economic activity. That includes manufacturing, it includes agriculture, it includes art, it includes feeding you. All of this energy that comes into the earth in the form of solar radiation, there's a certain amount of it that comes in. This, I think, is getting to your point. The problem with the sun is that it's a flow-limited resource, not a stock-limited resource. Does anybody know what I mean by those two terms? Jonas, you say you know. What do you mean?
Pretty confident I know. Flow limited means that it's, the difference is that when something is stock limited, the problem is that we have some amount that we can draw from. The speed isn't the problem. The problem is we're gonna run out of just stuff to use.
So fossil fuels are a stock limited
Yeah.
resource. There's a certain amount of coal in the ground, there's a certain amount of oil in the ground, there's a certain amount of natural gas in the ground, and the only thing that prevents us from utilizing it fully is how fast we can pump it out of the ground and dig it out of the ground.
Mhm.
So there's a stock of it, and we can get access to it, and we're limited by nothing more than our technology to get that energy.
Yeah.
Sunlight is flow limited, because the sun, what will it do tomorrow?
Produce the exact same amount of terawatts. that
The
it
sun will
does.
come out tomorrow. Bet your bottom dollar. Something, I don't know the
There'll
words.
be some.
There will be sun tomorrow, but sun trickles out at us because we're way far away from the sun. We're this tiny little target. And so every day, there's a set amount of sunlight that comes to us. We use way more energy every day than what the sun brings us. The reason we can use way more energy every day than the sun supplies is because we're tapping into these stock limited fossil fuels. And so, because it's a stock limited form of energy, we're gonna run out of them eventually. And at that point, we're going to have to slow down our human activities so that our human activities and the energy that we need to power those human activities equals the amount of sun that's coming from the sun. Because we will have run out of oil, we will have run out of coal, or we will have run out of natural gas. But the whole reason that we have those stocks is because millions of years ago, hundreds of millions of years ago, plants took that sunlight, did photosynthesis, stored it in their bodies, it went into soil, it got covered up, it got crushed under lots of layers of rock, it got subjected to pressure and heat, and it got transformed into fossil fuels. So we're funding our current energy usage off of millions of years of stored photosynthetic activity.
Only just to clarify that, most of the soil respiration was back in the atmosphere. there's a little bit, very small amount every year
It
that
gets
goes
mineral.
into the long-term storage system. The only reason we have enough fossil fuels to support all the many years since the Industrial Revolution and the remaining years we have to use them is because the amount of time, 300 million years or more, we've been accumulating plants as fossil fuels.
So how long will it last?
It's a little different for each one of them.
We're past peak oil in North America. We passed peak oil, so if
The
you
rate of use is faster than the rate of discovery. You have more resources.
yeah, so you can build this diagram for any nation on the planet, but for oil, we started extracting oil in the late 1800s with oil that was first discovered in Texas when they started drilling oil, and it goes up and it fluctuates somewhat. It peaks around 1975, and we've basically been going roughly down until just recently when Shell oils has been ticking it back up. And for any country, there will be a similar graph like this, and depending on how long you've been extracting your resources and how many resources you have, there comes a point where you reach a point where you're drawing out as much as you're ever going to draw out, and all the oil after that is found in deposits that are harder to access, and your overall rate of extraction goes down. This is known in the economic literature as peak oil. And once you pass that peak, it means that you're basically tapping into the latter half of the reserves that you have, essentially. And this is why shell oil became a thing, is because shell oil, there's oil in shells, and we didn't have the technology to access it. And then we developed the technology, but there were cheaper ways of doing it, and it wasn't until oil got more uncommon and became more expensive that then these more expensive ways of getting harder to get to oil became cost effective, essentially. So it varies by country to country, and we passed it a long time ago in this country.
We passed it in the 70s.
Yeah, 75 was about when we hit peak oil in the U.S. So I did the same kind of presentation with my ecology food students in CCAT 259, and they're like, oh, well, so this is all coming from plants. So oil and natural gas and coal and stuff is a renewable resource. I'm like, yeah, if you've got 100 million years to wait for it to renew. But the thing of it is that because we're burning off a lot of these plants, the plants and stuff that are not dying and becoming incorporated into soil because we're burning them for agriculture and stuff like that, that carbon isn't going into long-term storage. It's just being blown right into the atmosphere. So 100 million years from now, the fossil fuel deposits that would have come from this period of history are going to be smaller than they were 150 million years ago, 200 million years ago. So for all intents and purposes for human lifespans, we can treat them as the stock-limited resources that they are. And so what happens as a result of this and this happening is carbon dioxide levels are going up. This is a long-term carbon dioxide record from the atmosphere. It was initially done at Scripps Oceanic Institute on the coast of California, and then they transferred monitoring to Mauna Loa volcano. And this is just a long-term record of CO2 going up. While it's going up, what else is happening with this chart? It's not just going up, what other dynamic is happening?
There's a lot of, I'm guessing, seasonal fluctuation.
So as it goes up, it also oscillates. What is causing this oscillation? It has to do with seasonality, not temperature. I mean, it's indirectly, but not directly temperature.
Spring growth.
So-
all that, stuff like that.
This is a period when CO2 is going down. This is a period when CO2 is going up. When do you expect carbon dioxide levels to go down?
Summer.
During the growing season, because this is when plants are doing CO2. Doing photosynthesis, rather. When does carbon dioxide levels start going up on a yearly basis? Okay, Rachel says winter. Why winter? Plants are not doing photosynthesis. What are they doing?
Dying.
Death.
They're not those trees dead?
Be good to eliminate.
They're all doing cellular respiration, aren't they? Now, they're maybe not doing it as quickly as they were a month ago, because they're not as warm as they were a month ago, but they're still alive, they're still doing cellular respiration. So in winter, plants are not doing photosynthesis, but they continue to do cellular respiration. And so during winter, this flux has gone down, while this flux has remained relatively the same. You say winter, as if it's winter everywhere right now. Where is it winter right now? Well, why does the southern hemisphere not make up for this, such that instead of oscillating, you would just have a steady rise over time?
There's more land mass in the northern hemisphere than the southern hemisphere.
There is way more land mass in the northern hemisphere than there is in the southern hemisphere. If you guys look at the maps that we showed you early on of the distribution of continents, and we showed you how seasonality occurs, when you look at where the equator is, you see that at this particular point in the Earth's history, there's a lot more terrestrial landmass in the northern hemisphere than in the southern hemisphere, which is why northern hemisphere plant dynamics governs this oscillation. It goes up during the northern winter, it goes down during the northern spring and summer, because that's where a big chunk of the respiration is occurring and a big chunk of photosynthesis is occurring. As it goes up, the atmosphere warms. This is the long-term temperature record from the early 1900s to the early 2000s, and it is inextricably going up. This is a figure from the International Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC report, the most recent one. And it basically shows you when they modeled this, if they modeled it with just natural factors, because things like volcanoes and things like this can alter global temperature, because volcanoes spew ash in the atmosphere. That ash reflects light and absorbs light and has a cooling effect. And so when they model it with just natural drivers, we should be kind of maintaining temperature. And when you add in human drivers, it shows that the models go up, and the models go up roughly with the way the actual temperature record has been going up. This is not so good when you go to think about charismatic animals like polar bears, but it's also not good if you think about agriculture. So when you think about agriculture and C3 and C4 plants, and how those plants respond to heat and carbon dioxide levels and things like this, you have to consider that C4 plants are things like corn and sugarcane, and C3 plants are things like wheat, and of course soybeans and all these other large agricultural commodities that we grow in this country. And so as climate changes, it has implications for our agriculture, because our agriculture is based on plants, and these plants have different photosynthetic systems. Those different photosynthetic systems respond differently to climate. And farmers should be worried about this, and if you talk to farmers, guess what? There are many farmers now in the 21st century that you don't have to convince that global climate change is a thing. The reason for it is they're seeing it affect their bottom line every year, and they're beginning to plan for changing agricultural patterns over time as this continues. Roger, do you have anything you want to add to all that?
I think I'm happy with that.
Okay, good. He did this last year, so I'm checking to make sure I'm hitting all the points. All right. Not a complicated system at all. Any questions about carbon? It's a boiled down carbon system because we focus mainly on glucose. Nitrogen, on the other hand, more complicated. Nitrogen is complicated because there's a lot of nitrogen in the atmosphere. Atmosphere is 78% nitrogen gas, but the problem with nitrogen gas is it's in this form N2, and the unfortunate thing about N2 is what kind of bonds are up there.
Triple bonds.
You have two nitrogen molecules, or nitrogen atoms, triple bonded to one another. And the unfortunate thing about triple bonds is what?
Very strong.
Hmm?
Very strong.
They're very strong. They're very hard to break.
Takes about a bolt of,
Hmm?
takes about a bolt of light.
Okay, so bolts of lightning can do this, but also bacteria can do this. And so when we think about making nitrogen available to most organisms don't have nitrogen available to them. You breathe in and breathe out 78% nitrogen every breath. But you don't get any of your nitrogen that's in your body from atmospheric nitrogen. It just, a little bit of it absorbs into your bloodstream, and the rest of it you just breathe out when you breathe out. So you have to take this nitrogen and get it into forms that are available to organisms. And these forms are ammonia, ammonium, it's because it's an ion, and nitrate, which is a negative ion. And these are the forms that are typically available to organisms. But in order to get this available to organisms, you have to first break this diatomic nitrogen apart, and it's really energy intensive because you have these triple bonds. It's really difficult. And so what we do is we have nitrogen fixing organisms. Which are primarily bacteria. And these nitrogen fixing organisms have an enzyme that helps them accomplish this. Once again, remind me what an enzyme is.
Catalyst for a reaction.
Hmm?
Catalyst for a reaction.
Okay, so that doesn't really tell me much unless I know what a catalyst is.
Speeds up a reaction. So protein.
Okay, you say it speeds up a reaction, but how does it speed the reaction up?
Lowers the activation energy.
Okay, it lowers an activation energy, so
like,
what does
lowers
that mean?
the amount of energy needed to start the reaction.
Okay, so if you have progress of reaction, this is a thing that you should be seeing in your chemistry classes, right? And we have energy, right? Then if you start off with a high energy molecule, you can't just necessarily break that molecule down. So this is energy from high to low. You have to generally add some energy before you can get that thing broken down into a set of lower energy molecules. So let's say that this is glucose, C6H12O6. You're going to have to add some energy to that, and then you're going to end up with low energy molecules down here, CO2 and H2O. And this energy here is the energy of activation. And all of this energy from here to here, this is given off as heat. Or if you're doing this metabolically inside you, it's captured energy that then you use to power your metabolism. When we do this with the cellulose that is wood, what do you have to do to light wood on fire? You have to add heat. What form of heat do you use? A flame, another flame, isn't it? You add a lot of heat to it, and then once you add that heat to it, you finally get over this hump of activation energy, and then what does the door do?
Stays low.
It goes ahead and burns itself out, releasing all of this energy that is in it, but you have to have a lot of heat. When you break down glucose, why do you not burst into flames?
It's not that much heat.
Because we have an enzyme that makes it so we can use lower activation energy.
You have an enzyme that lowers the activation energy to start this process off. So when we think of a catalyst, when we think of lowering activation energy, be clear with what we're talking about. It basically is a way of getting chemical reactions to proceed at lower temperatures than they would normally proceed without the presence of those enzymes. It's doing exactly what you say. It is lowering the activation energy, but you can also put it in plainer language that might help you understand that. Bacteria have an enzyme that helps them do what? Helps them break apart this diatomic form of nitrogen that you would normally need a lot of energy, a lot of activation energy to accomplish. And so that's why we have to rely on nitrogen-fixing bacteria. And so what nitrogen-fixing bacteria do is they take nitrogen, a ton of energy, 16 ATP, some hydrogen ions that they get from water, and they basically produce 2 molecules of ammonia. And plants can readily absorb ammonia and use it, and you get a bunch of spent ADP out at the end of it. But it's a high, even with enzymes, it is a high energy process. So nitrogen fixation is carried out by a number of different bacteria that are associated with plants, Rhizobium and Frankia. There are also free-living bacteria in the soil that also do nitrogen fixation, things like Azotobacter and all sorts of cyanobacteria. So this is where you then get the necessary nitrogen that you need to start using to put together amino acids and other nitrogen-containing compounds. The enzyme that is used for this is nitrogenase. This is the enzyme that catalyzes this reaction. And once again, you trace elements that are important for plants like molybdenum and iron are used in nitrogenase to catalyze ATP, break ATP up, release that energy, and that energy is used to break apart the diatomic form of nitrogen. So it basically takes about 10 grams of glucose to fix 1 gram of nitrogen. So that's a huge energy input in order to get this nitrogen broken apart and ammonia created. Now, where do we find these nitrogen-fixing bacteria? We oftentimes find them in association with plants. So this is a legume. I don't know what legume this is, but those are the root nodules. If you cut those root nodules open, you'll see that they're packed full of tissue, and the tissue that they're packed full of is red colored or pink colored. This is a compound called leg hemoglobin. And one of the reasons that they have this pink color is that this molecule, leg hemoglobin, actually picks up oxygen, and it's because this equation, this process of doing nitrogen fixation, functions best in anoxic conditions, in conditions where there is no oxygen. And so the leg hemoglobin that is produced by the plant removes the oxygen from the plant roots and creates an environment that is more conducive to doing nitrogen fixation. So if you cut these open and they were fresh, you would see that they all have a pinkish hue to them. But in that tissue is also all these bacteria that were once soil bacteria that became incorporated into the root of the plant by basically infecting the plant and then causing the plant to build up tissue around them, and then they become these nodules mainly full of bacteria and cells containing like hemoglobin, and that's where nitrogen fixation occurs. They take atmospheric air that is in the soil, so soil is porous, it has air pockets. Those air pockets are going to, in some ways, be similar but also different from atmospheric air. They're going to be higher in carbon dioxide than they are in atmospheric air because you have decomposition going on in soils. But they have plenty of nitrogen. They're going to take the nitrogen that is in the air in these in these air pockets and convert it into ammonia. This is a type of mutualism. In mutualism, remind me again, what's the nature between the two species in terms of who benefits and who doesn't?
They both
Yeah,
benefit.
for benefits.
In a mutualism, species A and species B both benefit. Easy to see what the plant's getting out of this deal. What's the plant getting out of the deal?
Fixed nitrogen.
Getting fixed nitrogen, nitrogen that it needs to build amino acids and nucleic acids and things like this. What are the bacteria getting out of the deal?
Presumably glucose, right?
They don't need nutrients from the plant. They need
Glucose?
glucose.
Bring back the energy.
Why?
Is it also?
Because it's costly to do this. Requires a lot of glucose to convert a little bit of atmospheric nitrogen to usable nitrogen. And so the plants get nitrogen, so it's a win for them, but there is a certain cost to that process of getting nitrogen, and that they give up some of their glucose, but presumably they have glucose to spare because they're doing a lot of photosynthesis. And so this is one mutualism that is important, at least in terms of nitrogen. Yeah.
So am I understanding correctly that the bacteria will associate with the plant after the plant has started growing its root system? That's when they'll find?
Yeah, as far as I know, that's the case. Yeah, you wouldn't expect to find nodules in the very young legumes.
The only plant where I know that the nitrogen fixing symbiont is maternally inherited is a floating aquatic fern where the symbiont is a cyanobacteria, not a nitrogen fixing fungus.
I did not know. So yeah, so all these bacteria that are ultimately associated with root nodules, they're basically soil bacteria that are already found in the soil. And this is actually one of the potential problems with fertilization. For example, when you fertilize a plot of land, because you're growing corn or something there, both in terms of nitrogen-fixing bacteria, and especially, I know most of this more so from mycorrhizal fungi, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. If you give plants the nutrients that they need, they actually cut off the supply of glucose to these symbionts that they are associated with. And so if you go out and measure the microbial communities, both bacteria and fungi that live in agricultural soils that have been fertilized for long periods of time, species diversity of symbionts has actually gone down because the plants, when you're giving them synthetic fertilizer, they don't need the symbionts as much. They basically cut off the sugar supply, and populations and communities of those symbionts actually goes down in diversity over time. And so you only enter into a relationship like this when you have something serious to gain, because you're also giving up something in the process. And so people have done studies where they look at mycorrhizal fungi, and they find that both standing stocks of mycorrhizal fungi and also diversity of mycorrhizal fungi are lower in agricultural fields that have been heavily fertilized rather than those that are not. So I already did this. What does everybody have to gain? And everybody has to gain nitrogen on the plant side and sugar on the other side. So I want you to think, we're almost out of time. There's some more slides about nitrogen fixation because there are a lot of other transformations that we have to talk about. The first of these is nitrogen fixation. So I want you to begin working on a box where we have the process, where we have the transformation, this is just another way of systematizing knowledge. We have who does it, and is it making in available or not? Because we have nitrogen fixation, we also have ammonification, which we haven't introduced you to yet. We also have nitrification, which we have not introduced you to yet. And we then have denitrification. The first three of these all make nitrogen available. last one of these removes nitrogen, and so you end up with N2 going back to the atmosphere. And so for nitrogen fixation, we can basically start working on this and saying, okay, well, what is the transformation? It's essentially taking nitrogen, that is atmospheric nitrogen, and the end product here is ammonia. Who does it? Well, in fixing bacteria, these are things like rhizobium and cyanobacteria. So we have the players, and it ultimately is making nitrogen more available rather than making nitrogen less available. There are equations for taking ammonia and converting it to ammonium, and there is an equation for taking ammonium and converting it to nitrate. All of these are done in different ways, but they all make nitrogen available. And then the last thing that happens is we can take things like nitrate, and those get converted back to atmospheric nitrogen. Once again, there's a set of organisms that do that. And so these fluxes that are also transformations, we can break them into kind of two categories. One set of transformations makes nitrogen more available. Another transformation takes nitrogen out of the ecosystem and puts it back in the atmosphere. I'm not going to ask you for all of the little intermediate steps of some of these, especially ammonification, but you should at least know what you begin with. Oh, this is wrong. This is NH4 plus. You should at least know what you start with and what you finish with, who does it, and what the net effect of it is on available nitrogen. Read the section of your textbook that deals with nitrogen cycling, and see if you can't fill in the rest of this table for Friday. Because we won't have class on Wednesday because it is advising day 2. Look for an email from me about lab tomorrow for data analysis and things like that. I'll probably meet with the water bug group second and the butterfly group first. So, and Dr. Judd has some things to hand out to you.
So, what's due tomorrow? There's actually
You have speeds?
oh yeah. No, I just.
Maybe I can instruct
Yeah,
them.
because your prediction is no morphology affects speed.
Isn't that the one
Jackson, this is the only one I didn't get back to already. As you know, I missed you this day that I gave those back. I didn't find a measuring diversity homework where it had the cons and math with some questions about definitions.
That's not the crux of your
Did you turn one of these in?
Yeah, I definitely did.
We did this one.
Yeah.
I thought you guys handed, I remember you just handed it to
Yeah.
each other, so I'll check again and make sure I didn't misplace it. when I see it.
Wait, can I do that really fast?
Is the homework that we all thought was due on like Friday, or is really due like next Monday?
Yeah.
It's due next Monday.
No,
It was.
It was. So it would have been due.
Sure, that would be a good
Last
use of your time after I shared that.
I can double check.
Okay.
If this was,
But I mean,
Yeah, so we can't.
we're somewhere. We're not like
Thank you.
we know what needs to be done. Like
Yes, at your stage,
we're good.
we can't do data analysis because we don't have the proper data in hand. So we'll talk about data analysis a little bit, but we won't spend any time on it. We'll have to do data analysis another time. So your group is technically behind because the morphology stuff isn't done yet. Just a reminder, I said this at the beginning, I have a measuring diversity preparation homework, and I have a concept query Google Earth introduction. These didn't have names, so I don't remember the word. Technical Elizabeth.
I got one from back.
Oh, she got hers back?
I did think one of them was mine.
Okay, all right.
That one's not important.
Now, if someone writes the A's in the fancy way.
Fancy way.
well, this is.
Yeah, I knew.
keep somebody else. Watch the video. Come see us. Questions, like always.
Are you gonna do this this time? Or you don't?
So on Monday is when we talk about VNet out. So we're coming to the end of this testimony, and next Wednesday is the end. So probably not any homework. The homework is to have your VNet out summary done.
Yes.
Yep.
It's okay. It's not expected.
How's it going, Miriam? Doing all right?